Behind quiet hallways and dimly lit rooms in nursing homes and senior centres, some residents and visitors never checked out. In these real stories, we experience late-night footsteps and creepy sounds in places where memories fade, but some spirits refuse to. These are the ghost stories that will stay with you. Tales from a Nursing Home, Stockton, California, USA, between 2017 to 2021. Caitlin had spent years working her way up through her required training and eventually became a caregiver and medical tech at an assisted living facility in California. For about 4 years, that building became like a second home to her. A place filled with routines, responsibility, and the quiet, often heavy reality of caring for people in later stages of life. It's the kind of job that changes you, because in a place like that, you don't just witness the physical struggles of the real world. You also start to notice the things that don't quite belong to the real world. Caitlin herself admitted, working in that environment, you see a lot. Some of it, of course, is expected. Some of it, impossible to explain. And one night, during a routine shift, she experienced something she still can't fully make sense of. It was a night shift, and the residents were asleep. It was calm and quiet. Caitlin was making her usual rounds, checking in on residents one by one as she travelled the dimly lit hallways that stretched out in several directions. When this incident occurred, however, she was alone in the hallway. Just her and the soft hum of the building at night. As she approached one particular room, she thought that she could hear something out of place. She paused. Yep, there it was. Footsteps. Now, they were faint, but they were clear. They seemed to be coming from above her from the second floor. At first, it didn't seem too strange after all. Staff moved around at all hours, doing their rounds and checks. But something about this felt a little bit off. The sound was too distinct, too heavy for the sound to be travelling through a concrete floor above. She took a few more steps to go to the next room she had to check in on. And she heard the footsteps again while she was in there. Again, she paused to listen. And as she stood there, the footsteps changed. They weren't staying above her anymore. They were moving closer. Closer than they should have been at this time of night with empty corridors. Caitlin frowned slightly, glancing around the hallway. There was no one there. No movement, no shadows shifting, nothing. And yet, the footsteps continued. Now they sounded like they were on her floor. What was worse was that it sounded like they were right near her and possibly moving towards her. Her body tensed, every instinct telling her something wasn't right. And then, the sound escalated. It sped up, and now what had been steady footsteps suddenly turned into a run. Heavy, rapid strides charging straight towards her. But there was still no one there. No figure, no source. Just the sound. Loud, immediate, and completely unavoidable. Before she could even react, a rush of air slammed into her. A sudden, forceful gust, as if someone had sprinted directly at her and passed straight through her body and down the corridor. Caitlin froze, completely still. Her heart was pounding and her skin was erupting in goosebumps, a cold chill spreading from head to toe. For a split second, it had all seemed so real, like something physical had just occupied the same space she was standing in, and it was a feeling that she couldn't describe, more terrifying than anything that she'd had ever experienced. And then, nothing. The footsteps stopped, the wind vanished, the hallway returned to silence, like it had never happened at all. Caitlin didn't move. She didn't speak. Just stood there, as if frozen in time, trying to process what she had just experienced. A few moments later, To one side of her, the silence was gently broken, rousing her from her dazed state. Slowly, she turned her head and saw that a few meters away, 2 other workers casually stood chatting in the corridor. They laughed as they chatted to each other, completely normal, unaffected, and casual. They hadn't even noticed Caitlin by the look of it, which meant only one thing. They hadn't heard the footsteps or seen the incident take place. Whatever had rushed towards Caitlin had been experienced by her alone. She was thoroughly creeped out, but later reflected and said that she didn't feel anything malicious. She said there was no sense of danger, but that didn't make it any less disturbing, because something had been there, something that moved with intention, and then disappeared without a trace. On another night, during an evening shift, Caitlin was assigned to the second floor. It was quieter than usual, as it was that strange in-between time when the day staff had gone and the night staff was settling in, and the building itself seemed to slow down. She wasn't working alone, however. Another caregiver was working the floor with her, easy to spot in the facility's standard colourful scrubs. After completing her rounds, Caitlin made her way into the medication room to finish charting what had been administered earlier in the evening. The medication room itself was small and clinical. A desk pushed up against the wall, paperwork neatly stacked, and the faint smell of disinfectant lingering in the air. She sat down, facing the wall as she wrote. The door behind her was left slightly open, which was not unusual. It was just enough to keep an ear out on the hallway. Caitlin was busy writing away and focused on what she was doing, when she was just about done. And then suddenly, something shifted. There was a movement just at the edge of her vision. Something passed by the open doorway. Fast. Really fast. Too fast to immediately process. Caitlin froze. Her pen stopped mid-sentence and slowly she turned her head towards the door to clarify what she may have just seen. She stared for a few more seconds and then she saw it again. A figure, gliding past the doorway, dressed in what looked like a white wedding gown, with flowing fabric and a soft, puffy veil trailing behind it. But it wasn't the dress that made her heart drop. It was the face, or what little she could see of it. There were no clear features and no details of this person's face, just a glimpse of skin that was unmistakably wrong. It was blue, pale and lifeless, like someone who had been gone far too long, or someone who had taken their last breath in the worst possible way. And then it was gone again. The entire encounter lasted less than a second. Caitlin pushed her chair back and stood up immediately, adrenaline kicking in as she darted over to the door. What was that, she thought? She stepped quickly into the hallway to follow up on what she had just seen. The entire hallway was empty and completely silent. But what made this whole experience even worse was the layout of the building. The direction that the figure had moved in led to a dead end. There were no turns, no rooms to slip into, and no exits. Whoever, or whatever she had just seen, had literally nowhere else to go. Caitlin stood there, staring down the corridor, trying to make sense of it as goosebumps started to crawl all over her skin. Her mind raced through explanations. Was it a resident? A trick of the light or exhaustion? But none of it fit. She stood there staring, contemplating what had just happened, when about 30 seconds later, she heard footsteps. Her co-worker appeared, walking towards her from the opposite end of the corridor, calm and normal and completely unaware of what Caitlin had just experienced. Caitlin immediately asked if she had seen anyone pass through. The answer came quickly as her colleague smiled and said no. But then something suddenly changed. The caregiver's expression shifted and there was a subtle tension. Her body language tightened, like the question itself had triggered something in her mind. She hadn't seen anything, but now she looked uneasy and uncomfortable, as if she suddenly didn't want to be standing there anymore. as she shifted nervously on her feet. And as for Caitlin, she was left with a question that has never been answered. To this day, she doesn't know what she saw walking past that doorway. Was it a trick of the mind, or something far more disturbing? Was it a presence still wandering those halls, dressed for a day that never came, and carrying the unmistakable look of something that should no longer be there? The final story that Caitlin shared from her time at this facility happened once again on a quiet night shift. It was one of those slow, heavy nights, the kind where it seems to drag and every little sound feels amplified. Caitlin was alone in the laundry room, methodically folding clothes under the hum of fluorescent lights. She had shut the door behind her, not for privacy, but because the machines inside were loud enough to disturb the residents if it was left open. Now, she wasn't completely alone on the shift. There was another staff member working nearby, cleaning up in the dining room down the hall. From where Caitlin stood, she had a clear line of sight to where her colleague was. All she had to do was glance out the small laundry window and she could see her colleague moving back and forth in the distance. At this stage, everything felt normal, routine, and safe. Until it didn't. After a few minutes, Caitlin paused. There was a strange sound she couldn't recognize at first, as it was only subtle, but it still stood out. She stopped folding and looked around, listening carefully. She couldn't quite place it, and then she saw it. The doorknob. It began to move. At first it was moving only slightly, as if someone were casually trying to access the room. Then it suddenly became more aggressive, as it started shaking and rattling. It was as if someone on the other side was now trying to force their way in. Caitlin froze. Access to the laundry room required a key, and the residents should have all been asleep. Her first thought was simple. It must be her co-worker. Maybe she needed something. Maybe her hands were full. Trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine, Caitlin walked over and grabbed the handle. The rattling stopped just as she pulled the door open, and standing there was no one. Just an empty hallway, silent and still. For a moment she just stood there, staring, trying to make sense of what had just happened, and what she was seeing. Or rather, what she wasn't seeing. She leaned her head out, scanning left and then right. Nothing. There was no movement at all. A cold and uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Trying to rationalize it, she quickly looked towards the dining room. And there was just what she expected to see. Her co-worker working in a different area, exactly where she had been the entire time. Still cleaning, still completely unaware of what was happening at the laundry door. At that point, the reality of the situation started to sink in. It wasn't her colleague, and it couldn't have been a resident either. There was no one in that part of the building who could move fast enough, quietly enough, to rattle a locked door and then completely disappear. There were no corners to hide behind, no rooms nearby, and no explanation. Caitlin checked the hallway one last time. It was empty, but now the feeling had changed. That quiet, routine night shift didn't feel so safe anymore. Work, however, had to continue. She closed the door and turned back into the laundry, and tried to ignore the creeping sense that something had just been standing by that door, trying to get in. Hi guys, this show is only made possible by the contributions of true stories from people just like you. If you'd like to share your experience for the show, you can contact us by email, details of which are in the description, or directly at the website at www.chillingtruetales.com. I can't wait to hear all of your chilling true tales. Whispers in the Hallways. Jackson, California, USA, circa 2024. Amy contacted me after listening to a previous episode about nursing home ghosts and was triggered by memories of her own experiences. They happened to her a few years ago, and she wanted to share something that, to this day, she can't quite explain. At the time, she was working as a program coordinator at a senior center in California. She'd been there for a while and knew the building well. She knew the routines, the schedules, and the usual flow of people coming and going. One afternoon, she stayed back late to finish some work. Everyone else had already left for the day. The building was quiet and empty, or at least it was supposed to be. Now, it wasn't completely unusual for people to be in the building after hours. There were certain groups that had keys and would come in for evening activities. These were things like classes or social group activities. There was one group in particular, a quilting group, that used the classroom down the back hallway. So one evening, when she was on shift and first heard voices, she didn't think much of it. Amy was sitting at her desk, focused on her computer and her work, when she started hearing what sounded like a conversation drifting in from that hallway. It sounded like two women having a casual chat. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that Amy could recognize the rhythm of a normal conversation. The strange part was, she couldn't make out a single word that was being spoken. It was like hearing voices just out of reach. It was familiar and natural, but completely unintelligible. Still, she brushed it off. She concluded that at this time of the evening, it was probably the quilting group, and she went back to work. One thing that wasn't in the front of her mind at that time was the layout of the building. The way that the building was set up was that there was a back door near that hallway, but it only worked one way. You could exit through the door, but you couldn't enter. To get into the building, you had to come in through the front and walk directly past her office door. The problem was that earlier that afternoon, all the doors had already been locked. No one had come in, and no one had walked past her. For a time, the voices continued, like two people just talking, laughing maybe, pausing, and then continuing again. Time passed as Amy worked away and eventually finished what she had to do. She packed her things and got ready to leave to get to her car. Now, to get to her car in the employee parking lot, she had to walk down the same hallway where the quilting group met and towards where the voices had been coming from. So Amy left her office and started walking towards her car. The conversation between the two ladies persisted, although quite softly. The conversation seemed to grow momentarily louder as she walked nearer, and then Amy noticed that as she got even closer to the quilting group room, the voices completely stopped. Just like that. No fading, no footsteps, just utter silence. She reached the classroom a little bit confused. This was the exact room where she had presumed the quilting group was meeting, and the same room where the voices had been coming from moments earlier. She paused, and then she looked inside. It was dark, and it was empty. The tables were all neatly in place, and the room was undisturbed. If the quilting group had been there, Amy realised she would have heard them packing up, moving chairs, folding tables, gathering supplies. But there'd been none of that. No movement, no noise, and no sign that anyone had been there at all. A cold realisation started to set in, and it was something that chilled her to her core. With a cold chill running through her, she quickly checked the back door. It was still closed securely. She then stepped outside and looked towards the parking lot, only to find it completely empty. There was no sign of any cars or people, with no one loading up equipment to leave, and not even a person walking away. And that's when it hit her, that there hadn't been anyone in there the entire time. and that possibly the voices she had been hearing hadn't come from anyone living. She paused as goosebumps ran like a wave over her skin and stood there for a moment trying to process it. She tried to rationalize it, but ultimately nothing made sense. She left the building in a hurry that night with chills running down her spine. And Amy said that to this day, it's the strangest, most unexplainable experience she's ever had. She had kept it to herself for many years, not even sharing it with colleagues, and the experience has stayed with her ever since.
If you'd like to submit your own chilling true tale, so that your story might be featured in one of these episodes, contact me through our website at www.chillingtruetales.com or on email on seekersosparanormal@gmail.com. Email details are in the description. Thanks again for joining me. Until next time.